100 proof. The Negro. They cut off his fingers and thumbs if they caught him reading those old books. After all, those books revealed his true identity. And they couldn't have him learning that now, could they? How else could they justify his persecution, torment, and murder? By the hands of the church, by the hands of the Christians. The church openly persecuted the children of Israel. In fact, they persecuted none other than the royal house of Judah. Now, while Judah was in captivity, Judah was fed from the mouth of the great red dragon and the daughter of Babylon. You see, the daughter of Babylon taught Judah his history, a version of history which began with slavery and the west coast of Africa. This altered version of Judah's history began in 1619 with the arrival of Africans in English colonies on the east coast of what would later give rise to the United States of America. Judah's history before 1619 was simply omitted, covered over with new books containing a slightly modified history. To cover up this truth, modern-day books occasionally omit key parts of quotes which describe the Jews as Negro or Black, often by using well-placed ellipses to hide the truth. We can even find modern books deleting entire paragraphs which describe the Jews as being placed on West and Central Africa in great numbers and then sold into slavery. We can also find modern books acknowledging the common understanding of Jews being Black during the Middle Ages, only to propose their Blackness as being metaphorical. Family. These are just some of the discrepancies found in contemporary books and reasons why you should go directly to the source and read it for yourselves. DNA of the Negro is arguably one of the most misunderstood DNA stories on Earth. You see, traditional DNA analysis rightfully trace so-called Negro DNA back to Africa. And these relationships are discovered by simply comparing present-day African American DNA with present-day African DNA. And as stated before, this analysis rightfully identifies our deep connection with our African brothers and sisters. However, there's one critical missing component in this type of DNA analysis, and it's called genetic bottleneck.
Promotion, they drunk at the problems that you was unloading and stop. She knows cause she is the same. She's trying to stop playing games. She said, Lord, forgive me. She said, they do not know what they do. They
You see, a genetic bottleneck event occurs when a catastrophic event of such magnitude, of such destruction, that it wipes out or greatly reduces an entire population. In other words, the population gets purged. And the so-called Negro has gone through multiple purging events. These DNA impacting events could be an earthquake, which levels an entire city. It could be a megablast from a sleeping volcano, which obliterates all life within 100 square miles. Or, in the case of the so-called Negro, it could be the transatlantic slave trade. Which murdered and displaced millions of people around the world over hundreds of years. Or a genetic bottleneck event could be triggered by an expulsion edict or an inquisition, which evicted and murdered hundreds of thousands of the House of Judah in Spain and Portugal. And so these major events, which caused hundreds of thousands of people to disappear from an entire region, subsequently changed the DNA profile of the surviving population. Most importantly, these genetic bottleneck events impact DNA matches which display on modern-day DNA reports. For example, so-called Negro DNA isn't found among certain modern-day populations in great numbers. And it's because the Jews were expelled from those places. For example, today's DNA reports don't show so-called Negro DNA matches in and around present-day Israel. However, if we instead compare so-called Negro DNA to ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites in Israel and Lebanon, we find something unexpected. We find so-called Negro DNA buried in the ground of ancient Israel before the time of the Messiah. Beirut, Lebanon. These ancient archaeological dig sites date back as far as 800 BC. Here, archaeologists discovered the remains of multiple people who lived in ancient Lebanon. These ancient remains are assigned ID numbers and dates. In this particular archaeological site in Beirut, Lebanon, we examined one of the DNA samples collected from an ancient grave site. DNA from this ancient individual is labeled SFI-43. This particular individual lived approximately 567 to 404 BC. Researchers compared the ancient DNA remains of SFI-43 to modern-day Lebanese and Egyptian populations, as well as samples taken from a previous report. They discovered something shocking. They discovered the ancient Lebanese labeled SFI-43 was not closely related to modern Lebanese populations. Instead, SFI-43 showed close relationship to ancient Egyptian DNA samples. This is related in the following graph. Notice the dark green dots of the ancient Egyptian DNA are close to the light green dots of the SFI-43 ancient Lebanese DNA samples. The same findings were illustrated in yet another graph. Now, in this particular graph, related or shared DNA between samples is displayed as red marks. Now notice SFI43 shows red related marks when compared to the ancient Egyptian DNA samples. However, researchers didn't stop there. They added one additional group to compare their ancient Lebanese SFI43 DNA to. They compared it to the E1B1A Yoruba DNA of West Africa. And they were surprised to see that it was a perfect match. And now, let's review what we've learned so far. Let's review how to properly research Negro DNA. If you want to find DNA of the so-called Negro in ancient Israel and the Middle East, look at the old bones. Or if you want to find DNA of the so-called Negroes in Spain and Portugal, look at the old bones and compare your DNA to the ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites from around the world. And when you do this using your very own DNA, you may just discover that it was your forefathers who lived in Israel and Lebanon during the times of old. And you may also discover that it was your forefathers who lived in the hometown of the sons of King David himself in Granada, Spain.